All right, our next guest wrote a fascinating book that I recommend people check out. It is called Woke, an Anesthesiologist's View. We'll be talking about some of the themes from that book today, but his name is Dr. Madhava Setty. He earned a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering from MIT and worked in the aerospace and defense industries for 6 years. He received his medical education at Baylor College of Medicine and training in anesthesiology at the University of Pennsylvania, and he became a diplomat of the American Board of Anesthesiology in 2003. He has been in clinical practice since 2002. So let's go ahead and bring him on in here. Dr. Setty, welcome to the 24th hour.
Thank you for having me, Andy. Pleasure to be here.
So I have not had you on my show yet, my regular podcast, and I think we might do something about changing that fact in the future here. But please tell us, this audience, more about your background and what interested you in studying how people think and react to difficult subjects like September 11th.
Yeah, that's a good place to start. I think you hit the highlights of my resume, if you will. I have training in engineering. I've worked in the defense industry for a half dozen years before deciding to go into medicine and learning about that entire field and that art. And I've been, interestingly, an anesthesiologist for about 20 years now. And it's fascinating because our challenge in the 9/11 truth movement, sometimes we consider it, how do we wake people up? So the irony of being an anesthesiologist is not lost upon me. Sometimes people ask, do you appreciate the irony of being someone who's putting someone to sleep all the time, trying to wake people up? But the reality is the challenge of an anesthesiologist in the operating room is not putting someone to sleep. That's very easy. It's the challenge is actually waking them up. That's where we earn our living. But to answer your question, why am I interested in the way people think? And I have to say that I'm a relative newcomer to the 9/11 truth movement. And I have a deep amount of compassion for those of you out there who have been doing this for 20 years or longer. I don't know how you've been able to maintain the hair on your heads without pulling it out after all of these years. So it wasn't until 2017 that I understood what had really happened that day. And for your audience, it didn't take very long, right? There are typical red pills in this. And for me, it was, of course, Building 7, having never seen that building come down before until 2017. And unlike many people, I would say that my approach to this was a little bit different because I did not go to the internet to find out what people were saying about this building. I went straight to NC Star 1A, the final report on the collapse of Building 7, offered by the National Institutes of Standards and Technology, to find out what they said. And, lo and behold, they basically proved their hypothesis wrong right out there. I mean, there is not a whole lot of evidence that they had. They just hypothesized. They built a finite element analysis model, and the model did not do what the building did. So they proved their hypothesis wrong. So what's left to be said? It was obvious. So the first thing I did before calling up NPR with the real story, assuming that they were going to call me back and, do a show on me, I went to a couple of my friends, one a mechanical engineer and the other a PhD in the applied sciences, and just tried to have a discussion. And it was just shocking to me to understand that we have a much bigger problem that we're confronted with, which is, if this was a rational world, the truth about 9/11 would be out there in full view. But we don't have a rational world. And the people that we would expect to be the most rational, the ones that have letters after their names, are in fact the most irrational. And that's why I decided that I had to take a closer look at how we as human beings come to conclusions and how we process information. And that is essentially the basis of my book, which you kindly presented to begin with.
That's right. And I've experienced that so many times myself working here at 9/11 Truth. I once had an architect try to convince me that Building 7 came down because there just happened to be an earthquake at the same time, same day as September 11th. They were just grasping at straws, making stuff up because they didn't want to look at the evidence that we were presenting them at our booth. So you run into a lot of that, and I really don't believe that education has anything to do with a person's ability to look at certain concepts. We're going to get into that because this book, again, is a fascinating book. Just looking at the way people sort of process information, but also go about it. Sort of a basis in sociology, I would say there. And it explores a number of subjects. Ours, of course, our only subject here is 9/11, but looks at things just sort of from not taking a side on it either. It's just sort of looks at some of the facts and looks at some of the arguments that people make for or against it, and kind of gets into some of the, I don't know if motivation is the right word, but you can describe it better. And I'm going to ask you to do that. Please summarize what the book seeks to explore and contributes to our national dialogue on these difficult subjects on 9/11 and how you go about it in this book.
That's a thoughtful question. I would say that if we can come to an agreement, and I'm guessing that our audience here understands what happened that day, or at least what didn't happen, which is a very interesting point, right? And this is part of my the thesis of the book, is science is a never-ending search for what is. We'll never get there because everything is connected. In order to know everything about one thing, you have to know everything about everything. So the scientific perspective on anything is to hold in one's mind the idea of uncertainty of your position. So in any case, so defining what isn't is much easier. In other words, what didn't happen. And if you want a good understanding of what didn't happen, just go read the official narrative, because that did not happen, right? Well, there's enough evidence to that. So why can't we see that that did not happen? And I'm talking about the official narrative behind the story. It has to do with biases, right? If we were looking at it objectively, we would be able to easily dismiss what the official story is, but we are biased. But it is not easy or even possible for a mind to identify its own biases. It would be akin to asking someone to see their blind spots. And even though we have a great deal of understanding of different kinds of biases in the human mind, it is not easy to identify your own. How do you know that you're biased? So what I've tried to do in this book is to approach it differently, which is to identify circumstances where bias could arise. And it is not easy to confront the topic of 9/11 cold with somebody in a conversation. So I try to do this in the book, which is to approach it obliquely. First creating a series of vignettes that are somewhat interesting, and just talk about it openly. This is what we know about it, and how quickly the reader will jump to a certain conclusion about, oh, well, this is what's happening, and then point out where the errors were in your understanding of why the solution isn't actually what you think it is. So the idea there was to soften the reader into accepting the fact that they could be wrong. And then the book does something very interesting. Quite frankly, the entire book is a setup of one of the chapters, which has to do with 9/11, because I realized that you cannot approach this topic cold, as I said, given how many biases are in people's minds. And the implications of challenging the story are often too great for someone to confront. So you have to approach it differently, in my opinion. This is, another strategy. I'm not saying this is the best way, but it's an alternative strategy. So that's the way the book goes. And I make I would say, a strategic decision from the get-go, which is to put the 9/11 story into a much greater context. And it is a risk, because sometimes when people see that you're talking about much more than 9/11, it becomes even more difficult to swallow. On the other hand, sometimes that's what's necessary, because looking at 9/11 as a standalone issue is also very difficult. because it challenges many, many different things about how you think about the world, from the validity of institutionalized science, the validity of published scientific literature, the trustworthiness of legacy media, the the fallibility of our government institutions. So it's impossible, honestly, in my opinion, to talk about 9/11 as a standalone issue. And I understand, like, for example, 8911 Truth is an amazing organization and has done a fantastic job of compiling the evidence and making it available so that people can reference it. However, it's not always the best thing to remain, in this idea of we're just going to talk about the science around 9/11. So, and I'm not saying that one way is better than the other way, but we need every single way. And we need spokespeople outside of, let's say, architecture or structural engineering to discuss 9/11. And, that's what I think this book offers as a new way of looking at things, to bring the reader to understand that there's far more at stake here than what happened on that day 23 years ago. So that is the approach. And, if I may expand upon this a little bit, is, the last few years, we have a phenomenally powerful attack on institutionalized science, and it's happening outside of 9/11 Truth. It has to do, obviously, with the pandemic. And, I'm not trying to take sides. I'm not telling your audience what they should believe about all of this, all of these shenanigans, but there were shenanigans. And it once again demonstrates the corruption of institutionalized science, the fallacy of going with the orthodoxy, whether that be scientific in terms of architecture, structural engineering, or epidemiology. So in many ways, these two movements, 9/11 Truth and what I would consider the health freedom movement, are extremely, extremely linked and synergistic, because in the end, we have the same adversaries. We're confronted with the fact that we have to dismantle the scientific orthodoxy and challenge the validity of trusted media sources. And so we have in each other powerful allies. And in my opinion, we have to work together on this and put aside differences about how we feel about specifics and come together with facing a common adversary.
Right. And, that's what we're trying to address with, I don't know if you've seen this, but we're working on draft lead because we challenged NIST. We sent a request for correction to them on their Building 7 report. There was a lot of back and forth, ended up in court. Court said that federal reports don't have to be scientifically accurate. Supreme Court won't hear it. So now we want to make it law that the scientific reports have to be accurate and give citizens the standing to challenge them. And what politician is going to say, oh, no, I think that the science should be wrong. I think that the government has a right to lie. I can see what their motivation would be for that, but it's going to be a difficult thing to say when confronted on that. Mm-hmm. What's interesting, I noticed this early on when I first started waking up to 9/11, even before I really knew all of the facts about the fall of these buildings, just talking about this casually with the public. You bring this up, even if it's somebody who has nothing to do with what happened that day. They didn't lose family in the towers. They didn't know anybody who was involved in the event. And people would react as if you're criticizing their sibling or something. The defense of the official story, even people that didn't like the Bush administration, people who were on the hard left, who were criticizing everything that Bush did day in, day out. You bring up 9/11 Truth and they say, that's disrespectful to the families. I don't want to hear that. That's a little too far. And it was just like this visceral reaction, just asking simple questions that were being brought up back in 2008. And, it's toned down a little bit, but it still kind of continues. And, you talk in this book about biases that people have. What biases are in play there in relation specifically to the issue of September 11th that we champion?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, I want to say that, interestingly, I don't bring up biases. I bring up sources of bias. Like, what are the conditions that give rise to bias? I would say the most predominant one would be the idea that uh, rejecting evidence based upon a foregone conclusion. This is something that is pivotal when it comes to challenging a very, very basic paradigm, which is to say that, well, we know that there was no evidence of controlled demolition to begin with. So any evidence that there was must be wrong. This is a very, very pivotal error, because if we're truly being scientific, we would look at the evidence first and then draw our conclusion. But what you see most people do is that they start off with, well, that's an absurd position to begin with. So any evidence that you show me must be wrong because I know that it wasn't this. Why are we doing that? And this is the fundamental challenge that we have when we're trying to overturn a fundamental paradigm of how we think about the world. We don't want to go there because we cannot believe it's something like 9/11. The idea that there could be a different story behind it is so egregious that we cannot look at it objectively. So that would be, I would say, the primary source of bias that keeps us from being objective about this. But in the end, all of these biases lead to the same thing. It is an inability to look at things openly. For example, like overconfidence in your position. How do you know you're being overconfident? Well, it's a thoughtful question. And I would say the answer is you're being overconfident if you can't listen to the other side. How did you jump to already knowing that they're wrong? Ask yourself, are you able to articulate their argument accurately? If you cannot do that, then you actually haven't listened to the other side. So these are the kinds of exercises that I invite the reader to do to get them to question how certain they are about their position. And, Andy, you and I probably have the same shared experience. I have never, ever in my entire, 7 years of trying to speak clearly about this topic, I've never encountered somebody who believes the official narrative who has actually read the technical documents provided by NIST. Never, not once. And this is what's so fascinating, is that usually, my conversations have to do with people with scientific backgrounds who proclaim that they're being objective and thorough, but yet they haven't actually read the source documents. And that should, if they were being objective, that should be disquieting for them, to get them to admit that, well, actually, I haven't really read, I'm just listening to what someone else has said about the source documents. You have to read them yourself. I mean, if you truly want to consider yourself to be an objective voice in the matter. So these are the kinds of things that I think are very important. Why haven't you read the source documents? How come you can't articulate what I've said about this? And, overconfidence in a particular position is very, very interesting. Another, idea that I explore here, and, again, these are fascinating topics. What is the difference between believing and knowing? Everybody says, oh, I know what happened on 9/11. Do you? Or are you believing somebody else? Because it's very easy for the mind to jump from believing to knowing. And, one example I bring up often in my public commentary is something like this, which is in 2012, the National Science Foundation asked the public a question. Do you believe the Earth goes around the sun, or do you believe the sun goes around the Earth? Right? And embarrassingly, 1 out of 4 Americans, and they surveyed over 1,000 people, think that the sun goes around the Earth every day. Embarrassing, right? I mean, like, how can people in 2024 not know this? And so then my point here is, okay, you know what the answer is? Prove it. How are you going to prove it to me? How are you going to prove it to me without referring to a third party? Like, I don't want you to go to NASA. I don't want you to go to your teacher or some book on astronomy. Show me how you know this to be true independently. And I would suggest that the vast majority of people do not know how to prove it. And if you don't know how to prove it, then you're just believing. You don't actually know. I'm not saying that the Earth is in the center of the universe. I'm saying that you don't actually know. If you can't prove it, you don't know, you believe. So that is, another way to insert yourself into a smart person's mentation to say, hold on a second, you're just believing things. So, this is another way of approaching the problem. And, it may be superfluous, but I feel like if you cannot talk a intelligent mechanical engineer to challenge the official story, then we're dealing with something beyond the cognitive mind and experience. We're dealing with something subconscious, and we have to pull on these threads if we want to make an impact.
Right. What I found works is asking questions more so
Yep.
than just stating a fact. Now, I've done my own share of showmanship and talking about how, I mean, because I believe it was a controlled demolition from the facts that I have
Sure.
looked at. But all AE calls for is a new investigation. Of course, we all are people and we have our own ideas on where the evidence leads to, and we've looked at it, I mean, objectively from the beginning. But after all these years, and with the cover up, that's where the evidence leads us. But as an organization, we just call for that new investigation, and then we present our case in the venue where that investigation takes place, hopefully in Congress. But what I do is I ask questions. If something doesn't make sense to me, or I see some kind of conflict in a person's reasoning, they said one particular thing about one matter, and then on a similar matter, they said the other thing. I asked them to explain that diverse, viewpoints on both of them. And typically you could get an idea of truth from the way the person answers, or, how they address that. So there are ways to get at truth without, when you can't necessarily prove definitively something, you can find the flaws in the argument that's been given to you, and at least let the world know that the final solution or the final answer is still not settled. Now,
Exactly.
in this, you got an area in here where you talk about the power of majorities, and this got me to thinking about how conformity is a survival mechanism, because human beings are social creatures. We have to rely on each other for so many things. Like, for instance, I don't know how to do anesthesiology. I have to, if I need that for a surgery or something, I have to go to you. And I can't learn everything in the world. So we all rely on each other for various things in this world. If you're ostracized from the group, it is actually a threat to your own survival. And I think there's something primal inside people's minds, going back to caveman days, that if you got ostracized from your pack, you're going to be worse off for your own survival. And so in a way, I think that it is a survival mechanism to shirk away from things that are too controversial. And that is how these official narratives are able to be cemented in the public's mind, even if people deep down don't believe them. I know lots of people who say that I'm probably right about 9/11, but I can't do anything about it, and it doesn't help me to think about it. And so, they're just going to choose not to. Give me your thoughts about what I just said about this being a survival mechanism to go along with the majority.
Well, I believe it is. I think, there's survival being part of the herd. What's missing here, I think, is that people have the wrong idea of what majority consensus really means. For example, if every person who votes A, let's say 75% of people vote A is the right answer, B is the wrong answer, there's a lot of power in that. If every single person in that 75% actually did the research and came to that conclusion. But most majorities are not made up of a group of people that all research it independently. Most of those people are just going along with a minority of people who they believe is looking at it correctly. So the majority opinion will be constructed or founded on actually a minority number of the population that we believe has done the research appropriately. So there is inherently a fallacy in thinking that most of the people will get it right most of the time. And that is exactly what's been happening right now, is that, like you said, or like I mentioned, most people haven't actually read the technical documents provided by NIST. So very few people are actually informed about what happened. That's the first thing. The second thing is, in order to come to a majority consensus, there has to be open discussion. Otherwise, you don't really have a consensus. And this has come about quite frequently during the pandemic, where qualified voices were excised from the discussion. I mean, people who, like, I consider my teachers, say in critical care medicine, who have been talking about this for a very long time. These are people who have written books that have published hundreds of peer-reviewed papers. They're not part of the discussion. You cannot include their opinion. That's not minority of people. And that doesn't mean that they're right or they're wrong, but you have to understand that your confidence in going along with majority is ill-founded, is what I'm saying. Does that make sense?
That's right. And you cut out for a split second there, but I do hear what you were saying. And I mean, we've seen a lot of conformity, of course, on this issue over the years. I mean, this is another interesting phenomenon. So I've kind of come to this conclusion. When I first woke up to 9/11, I thought, oh my God, all I'd have to do is just show some people some YouTube videos and we're going to have this massive uprising. I was very naive when I started.
Yeah.
And I think we all were. I think all of us, like, who have been around that long, just thought, oh my God, you just watch this YouTube video and everyone's going to suddenly have like a little light go on over their head and join the group. But there's so many things that play into human decision making. I mean, even irrational things. Edward Bernays, I actually read his book. But there are certain people, like, it takes like a certain kind of person to wake up to this and openly acknowledge it, and a certain type of person to dismiss it. But within the people who acknowledge it, and I just want to get you, this isn't mentioned, I don't believe, in your book, but it's just your thoughts on this phenomenon. All right, so we're all united on 9/11 truth and justice, and we're all trying to get a new investigation into this. And we come from so many different backgrounds. Some people from the right wing, some people from the left wing, and people who believe in various different other issues. Some people may not believe in that. But what happens is, if you have some prominent voice out there that speaks out in favor of our cause, comes out and says, you know what, I think there is something to the Building 7 evidence that architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth talks about. If the person happens to be on the right or the left, or if they believe in something that the supporter or people in the 9/11 Truth movement don't believe in, they want to reject that voice, even though it's coming in support of something that we all agree on. So, like, to me, that's helpful. Even if I don't agree with somebody's politics on, healthcare or the environment or whatever, if they come out and if they're a prominent person, they got a big voice and they say, oh, I agree about the need for a new investigation, I say that's a good thing. But the majority of people now, it feels like, want to just reject a helpful voice because of some outside issue. And I just want to get your thoughts on that phenomenon and what we do about that.
That's a huge problem. 100%, Andy. And I would say you really hit the nail on the head with that. It's very sad to me to see people in our community bicker over the details. That's the first thing. The second thing is we have to look. There's a lot of us out there, more than we realize, and we often hear from a select group of people over and over again, which is great. I mean, we have great authorities at AE 9/11 Truth and other 9/11 Truth organizations that are spot on factual. We need to get more voices involved, because it's easy to take down one or two voices, or even a handful of voices, for the reasons that you mentioned there, because so-and-so is from the wrong political party, so we can't listen to anything they're saying. We need to have people across the board, multi-specialty people in science, talking about the same thing and sticking to the facts, because they're I'm saying the the orthodoxy that dismisses us out of hand looks to divide us and accentuate the differences. And we have to be very aware that that's what's going on as we engage with other people. I believe one thing we can do better is to educate each other on how to have the proper conversation. Where do we get tripped up? And a couple of things that for the audience here, in my experience, these are suggestions. Where do we engage? It's usually not so much at the Thanksgiving meal. It's usually on social media, right? The object there, if you are contesting the official narrative that someone is offering, the objective is not to convince them that they're wrong. Like we're missing that. We're not going to do that. No one on social media is going to admit, oh, well, Dr. Setty, you're right. Forgive me. The objective is to convince the audience that you have a better argument. The thousands of people that may be witnessing this exchange, some of them are going to say, wow, this guy, I don't know who he is. He's not even an architect. He's an anesthesiologist, but his arguments are pretty solid, and he does not get triggered into using polemic language. I'm going to listen to this guy because that's how they make up their mind. And we often forget that because we get pushed and instigated into adopting the same tone that we're being attacked with. And we have to rise above that. This is an important part because this is going to take a group effort. Like all the things that we're doing, the need to bring about a reinvestigation, to exploit this in the courts. Honestly, let's be very real here. This is a very, very difficult challenge unless you have the majority of public opinion behind you. Because, look, I don't know for sure. I think all of these pursuits, in terms of assembling grand juries, presenting evidence, getting a reinvestigation, they're controlling the media. They're controlling scientific organizations. They're controlling the publication of the responses, the request for corrections. All of that is being controlled. I think it's slightly naive to think that they don't control the courts as well. And I'm not saying that they're absolutely controlling all of it, but we have to be aware of the fact that that's going to happen unless we have the majority of the public behind us first. That's when we can exact true reformation of the problem. In order to get public opinion, we have to comport ourselves better than the other side. And we have to teach each other how to engage with others who disagree with us. And we have to understand that it is extremely, extremely unfortunate when someone on our side doesn't explain correctly or cites information that's wrong, because that is going to be used to exploit us over and over again. And it just is so frustrating to see people who have the right intention, who understand what happened, but bring up the wrong evidence at the wrong time or attribute too much certainty to what they're saying. These are all weaknesses that get exploited by the other side to dismiss our argument out of hand. So I think that our community right now, 23 years later, is ready to learn how we can each be advocates for this in a more effective way. That's been my hope, and one of my goals in this is let's figure out how to have a better conversation.
That's right. And we also have people that act bombastic, and I understand the passion, but you got to have the patience for the long game and just understand that change doesn't happen in 2 hours like it's a movie or something. It takes a long time. I mean, abolishing slavery in this country, we hear about Lincoln and the Civil War and everything, but it actually took a long time and the efforts of many people to make that issue go to the forefront. So you got to have patience out there. Dr. Setty, I want to thank you so much for coming on to our event tonight. Again, the book is, I want to make sure I get the full title right here. It is Woke, an Anesthesiologist's View. So check that out on Amazon.com. But we're going to have you back at some point, and good luck to you in your own endeavors.
Thanks, Andy. It's great to be with you, and let's get it done.